Welcome everyone to the Stoa. Today is the first session of a new Philosopher-in-Residence series at the Stoa. And I was thinking about who would be a good Philosopher-in-Residence for January. And it was a no-brainer. Sebastian Marshall came to mind. He was previously at the Stoa, had a really good session. And I've been following Sebastian for a while. He's a philosopher entrepreneur and founded something called Ultraworking, a company that builds performance technologies that augment humanity's ability to reliably do extraordinary work. And they have something called a few features, and one of them is a pentathlon that's coming up, and I was coming up on January 14th and 29th. And Stoas have a promo code for that, which is on the Patreon webpage. And this is going to be a 5-part series that officially starts in January, exploring what Sebastian calls industrial philosophy, applied philosophy, the type practiced by people in difficult practical situations. So think entrepreneur and military and in industry in general. So I'm super stoked about this series. And I'm just going to take in Sebastian. He's going to run the whole, he's going to take over the Stoa for the next 90 minutes or so. And then he'll set the events protocols. So that being said, so I'm just going to make sure everyone can unmute themselves. They can. Sebastian, welcome back to the Stoa, my friend.
Hey, thank you, Peter. Great honor and a great pleasure. Well, before we get into it, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. Let's get to know each other a little bit. I have 2 questions for you. If you'll let me know in chat before we get started. How many Stoa sessions have you come to? Like ballpark, right? If you're a very precise person, I don't even know that it was 37, a few dozen. We'll be just fine. So give me a chat. Also, please feel free to flip your cameras on. One thing I do whenever I'm speaking somewhere or presenting somewhere, this is a really great honor and a great pleasure. Back when I was in the nonprofit and education world, before I was a capitalist entrepreneur CEO, I had the privilege of speaking with and working with many of the top universities around the world, not just in the United States, but also in Canada and in China, top business school in Colombia, Alsace, wonderful people there. And, one thing I try to do is I just try to pay attention to where people are at. So you can actually, it's not rude at all. If you're bored, just look bored and I'll go faster and I'll get to something more interesting. All right. But if you're having a good time, then maybe we linger a little longer on a point if it's really resonating for people. So I actually try to, I'm not here to hear myself talk. I have some things that I think are very interesting and very practical. If your camera's on, you get much more of a vote, relatively speaking. I won't be watching chat while I'm doing my thing. So, this sucks, man. Hurry it up. Just camera on and just have the appropriate level of engagement you're having, and I'll know. So, all right, people coming to Stoa sessions. Let's look at that. For first one, hey, on Peter and all the Stoans' behalf, welcome. I'm in residence. I'm a guest here, but my pleasure to say welcome to your first one. You first one as well for Leo. Welcome. 7, approximately 25. A boatload. 5, over 1,000. It's an incredible thing that's happening here. This is really cool. Under 5, 5 to 6, no camera, not a problem. We got some people flipping cameras on, which I appreciate. 30 plus. Okay, nice mix there. Okay, I have another one for you. This is a little bit more of a personal question. How optimistic are you about 2023? You don't need to write an essay, just a lot, not at all. Very optimistic, somewhat. 3.5 on a 5-point scale. 2.5 sigma. But which direction? Which direction? If you're 2.5 standard deviations on the good side, that's good. But 2.5 standard deviations of you think it's just short of a hellscape on the other side of this thing. Yeah. 4 out of 5, 6 out of 10. 2022, 2023. Thank you. Good catch. Precision. Medium, a lot. Positive. Okay. Yeah, people are starting to come out of it. I think we probably would have heard maybe a little bit worse than that a year ago. So I think this is a great time to be here. I'm going to go through pretty much everything we're going to do across these 5 sessions. are going to have a light theoretical component. Today might have some of the more theoretical component of it, but also to make it really, really practical, right? So, as you're participating, as you're listening in, I'd really encourage you to use this as a springboard to actually do some stuff to improve your life with. That's why I'm here. I think there's some interesting theoretical stuff that we could do and we can talk about. I think there's some interesting kind of historical points that you become aware of them, and it like makes history and the history of philosophy and stuff make a lot more sense. But at the end of the day, we all want to have like really cool lives. We want to do interesting stuff with our lives. Some people are into the pursuit of more enjoyment. Some people are more in the pursuit of meaning, or they're trying to actualize something in the world. But all of us want to have the days go a little better, a little more like how we want them to go. The weeks go a little bit better, a little more how we want them to go. And I want to help facilitate that as much as possible. So, when we get into more interactive elements, please do participate. I know it can be tough. I know it could be tough to like listen to something and then like, cool, now we're going to go and we're going to interact and stuff. So that's why I wanted to chat a little bit up front. The other thing I'll say is just like a little housekeeping note. Just today only won't be a problem the other 4 times. I've got amazingly great Wi-Fi. I'm in Japan. I came to meet up with our CTO a couple days ago in Japan. I've got amazingly good Wi-Fi here. 50 up, 50 down, that occasionally gives out for 5 to 10 minutes. I got a redundant Wi-Fi source. I'll switch over. Peter will be on the commandeered into being extemporaneous zone as the host. If that happens, it's no disrespect. And when you have like bad Wi-Fi, you know what to do. You have great Wi-Fi, you know what to do. When you have great Wi-Fi that's intermittently unavailable for 5 minutes, tricky problem. I don't know. I don't think anyone's cracked this one on a protocol level. So if that happens, we'll just deal with it and we'll rock and roll. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a question that was, I don't know, this was kicked around for about a decade in my social circles. Like, what the heck happened to philosophy? Like seriously, like what the heck happened to philosophy, right? You look at somebody like an Aristotle, right? And just Wikipedia. His writings cover many subjects, including physics, biology, zoology, metaphysics, logic, ethics, aesthetics, poetry, theater, music, rhetoric, psychology, linguistics, economics, politics, meteorology, geology, and government. And he was the tutor to Alexander the Great and did all kinds of cool stuff, and tramped around a bunch of islands doing marine biology and studied the constitutions of a bunch of different states to figure those out, and did a bunch of practical how to live stuff. Some of those beautiful writing on friendship and how friendships are formed, like really great friendships, what goes into that. And like the philosophy is not that right now. And so like, what the heck happened, and how do we get the most out of it? And I actually think there's like an answer to what happened. And I'm a bit of an amateur historian. I have a love of it. Amateur originally meant like love of the thing. It didn't mean like bad at it. And I'm a bit of an amateur historian, and it was actually in my historical studies, just kind of informally, that I figured out something that happened that was really interesting. So we're going to talk about that. We'll do some practical things at the end. And then, I'm going to make a lot of time and space to engage if you want to do some practical experimentation and things like that, right? So here, I won't bury the lead. What I think happened to philosophy is that natural philosophy was an inseparable part of philosophy from time immemorial to 1850, 1890-ish range. At that point, natural philosophy, and people, by the way, who here already knows, cameras on, people who already heard natural philosophy and knows what that entails and such? Okay, you've heard it before. For the people who haven't. It's now called science. Science got broken out from philosophy, but from like the start of time in the Western tradition, and I think it probably went pretty similar in the East, from the start of time when people were doing philosophy, physics, biology, marine biology, ecosystems, life. What is this stuff that comes out of the sky that is sparky? Is it from Zeus? Is it some natural force, electricity, whatever, right? That and like what is government and what is a good life was like the same domain. I'm not making this up. This is true, right? Isaac Newton, right? His book is Principia, right? So it's the principles of natural philosophy. Like the physics book was a philosophy book, right? And that was still true in the 1600s, and that wasn't true in the 1900s. You go look up Richard Feynman, who's a lot like Newton. He's kind of like an evolved version of Newton, right? And it doesn't list philosopher on his bio on Wikipedia. Scientist comes up like 30 times. Physicist comes up a bunch, not philosopher. And I think the man was a philosopher. I think the moral philosopher. I think he had a lot of really interesting ideas. I think he was an epistemologist. Certainly a scientist. He was certainly a physicist. He was a natural philosopher. That went away. And a lot of bad stuff happened. This was the interesting thing for me. The second point. A lot of the great philosophers were also soldiers. Who here knows Socrates was a decorated soldier? Anybody who knew this? Yeah, they kind of like skip that in Philosophy 101, don't they? Right? And those are in the Peloponnesian War. Messy, brutal, nasty. Like ancient warfare is like nasty, right? Ancient warfare is like long, grinding, slow endurance contests that not much happens. And then if you slip up, you get stabbed, right? And then when enough of the people on one side get in a compromised state, they're wounded, they're retreating or whatever, then it's a massacre. So you're trying to hold out against that with these like long, brutal endurance contests in hand-to-hand combat in the ancient world. And like that shapes who you are. Xenophon, who's another student of Socrates, is a contemporary of Plato. Xenophon is more famous than Plato in many, many eras. Really well-loved philosopher in a lot of things. I believe he wrote the first book on economics called Economics. That was more about household management, it's not modern economics. He was on a disastrous expedition into Persia. He was a mercenary during the Persian Civil War. And like their side, this was the original betrayed at a banquet thing. Their officers got invited to a banquet and like got slaughtered by the Persians under a treachery thing. And they had to fight their way out of Persia step by step. And so, you see these patterns as well. Descartes, I think, therefore I am, combat engineer. Wittgenstein wrote the Tractatus. A lot of people think he's the most important philosopher of last century. He was writing the Tractatus during some of the most dangerous jobs on the Eastern Front of World War I. So we'll look at some of his notebooks a little bit today. We'll look at one entry from one of his war diaries, right? And what this had was like, it shapes your thinking because you could be like completely sure your side's going to win the battle. You're coming in with high morale. You're really excited. You listen to the leader, whether that's the statesman or the general, and says it's going to be great. And you're very confident. And then you lose and you're having a fighting retreat and you're like, what went wrong? Right? And it makes you just kind of like, it gives a deep sense of humility and like an urgency about being right. There's like a very much an urgency to be right if you're going into combat, and we live in a much more peaceful world. That's one of the triumphs of the modern world. A lot of philosophy now, there's no urgency to be right, not at all, right? And what I think is where there's increasingly great work happening in philosophy, it's coming from industry, right? I think it's from people in industry. They're often not classed as philosophers. I think they will be later. But I don't think it's coming necessarily out of academia, but from people engaged in fields where they can definitely be wrong. People who are engineers, who can be like, this type of engine will work, and then it doesn't work, right? People who are in finance, they're like, this trade is a great trade, and then they lose their shirt, right? Someone, again, in the field of arms, right? So this is what we're covering, and I think this is just really cool and really insightful. Then I'm gonna like highly encourage you to think about setting up some sort of very small experiment that you can run over the next week going into 2023. And that's why I said to Peter, he said, can you do January? I said, can I come a couple of days before January starts so we can start the new year a little bit strong? He said, all right, let's do it, right? And I think we can build up our techniques, and we'll do this in other sessions. There's some very practical techniques around like scientific literacy and statistics and stuff that like shouldn't be intimidating. They should kind of fit like a glove. And those will let you like take aspects of your personal life or your profession, the craft that you do, whether you're a computer programmer or an artist or any number of fields. And like, hey, does this go try? And we can like say we tried. So I'm having no promises that we're going to be like much better thinkers about like deeply abstract topics. All right. This was the thing of Phil meant love. Sophia was a personification of wisdom. So it just meant you love wisdom. It just means you liked learning things. The formalization, the formalization of philosophy into the academic fields and subfields where there's like metaphysics and epistemology and logic and whatever. That came much later. People that were in a philosophy back in the day were like super curious people that want to know how the world worked. And they were oftentimes very pragmatic people that were like, okay, like if we're getting together at an assembly in Athens, like how do we have like a good assembly to figure out what we should do as a city for the upcoming winter, right? Again, where I think things went wrong was the divorce of philosophy and natural philosophy, right? So Newton, 1687, principles of natural philosophy, right? Newton thought of himself as a philosopher, right? And he would have been welcome when people are talking about ideas about like, hey, what's truth? What's beauty? What's a good life? What's a good government? How do different governments run? Right? What are moral principles worth living by? Like people have been very comfortable inviting him into those rooms and they'd be like, and how do the celestial bodies work? And like, why does an apple fall from a tree? And stuff like that. We're still in good shape back then. Yeah, by the 1900s, Feynman, who I think is a philosopher, he wasn't classified as one anymore. Natural philosophy had gone away, right? Now he's a physicist, he's a scientist, he's not a philosopher. And like, I think science did okay. I think there were some downsides to science, to these things getting broken off, right? But I think philosophy suffered tremendously from science getting pulled out. Science was like the crown jewel. Natural philosophy, I think, was the crown jewel of philosophy in that it gave you something where there were like right and wrong answers, right? You could say, hey, if we like mix these two things together, what happens? Chemistry, right? And like it goes the way you want or it doesn't. You heat it up and like it works or it doesn't. And if somebody's like getting all the chemistry right, and they were like making good advances on it, and they were sharpening up their thinking, they were making more interesting stuff on a chemical level, and that was informing how you could do blacksmithing or whatever, then you're kind of on the right track. And if somebody's always having like bad ideas about like, hey, let's just mix the things together and then like we'll chant a little bit and then it'll turn into gold or whatever, it's like, yeah, maybe not. And people did go down those branches. Newton looked into both alchemy and got into some deeply religious studies, and not as well known for those. Obviously, they weren't as fruitful as his work in physics, right? The value of being in difficult circumstances and those shaping them. So this was a wonderful website. You can still find it if you go to like the Internet Archive, right? The Wayback Machine. Dr. John Preston, the University of Reading. He put together a chronology of Wittgenstein's life. Anybody ever read the Tractatus or try to read it? Okay, it's tough. It's difficult. It's a difficult book. He's looking at like, hey, how do we know things are true or false, and like what's going on in language, more or less, right? And a lot of people think he's the most important philosopher in the last century, right? And here's an entry from his war journals that was on this excellent website that's now down. You can still find the archive of it. 1914, 29 September, Tuesday. In his diary, Wittgenstein mentions that this morning a corporal who was sick with dysentery was brought into the hospital, and that there are now many cases. He notes that he himself did some philosophical work, but without success. I'm still not clear and have no overview. I see details without knowing how they likely fit into a whole. In an entry whose text is incomplete and heavily scratched over, he then records that every problem is the main problem. He urges himself not to be faint-hearted, but to take courage. In the evening, he records he worked, not without success. The notebook entry corresponding to this not unsuccessful work begins by declaring that the general concept of the proposition carries with it a quite general concept of the coordination of proposition and situation. Solution to all my questions must be extremely simple. Wittgenstein's super technical, by the way. I never understood it until I actually started to read his war journals and then some simple explanations. And I was able to, understand a third of the Tractatus, let's say, right? He then had an insight arising from the Paris law court scenario he had recently read about in August. The idea of propositions as models. And a proposition is if the world is put together experimentally. This, he thinks, must straightaway yield the nature of truth. He then considers hieroglyphic writing, in which each word is a representation of what it stands for, as well as the fact that pictures of situations can be right or wrong. He sketches two people, A and B, sword fighting, explains how the sketch might assert A is fencing with B by virtue of one stick figure representing A and the other representing B. It's picture writing form. It can be either true or false, people use sword fighting or not, and that is independent, right, of its truth or falsehood. He declares it must be possible to demonstrate everything essential by this. So the real messy life, and like this led to like one of the most famous works in philosophy, the Principia Logica Tractatus. It's like somebody came in a hospital with dysentery. He worked on a like a scout ship, like a searchlight ship, on one of the rivers in the Eastern Front. He was in an artillery workshop where there was often explosions. They didn't have modern controls. And later he was an artillery spotter on the Eastern Front of World War I. It was one of the most dangerous jobs. He was like doing calculus and trigonometry, like up in a tree, to call down artillery strikes in the other army, right? The other army doesn't like having artillery strikes called down on them. So they would sometimes call down artillery strikes on the tree or try to have a sniper shoot the person in the tree, right? And then he would climb down from there at the end of the day doing super difficult math in the air, right? Risking getting killed. And then he would like sketch out like, hey, what does a word mean? Well, words were originally hieroglyphics. Those were like pictures. And then it was like either true or false. So if somebody draws like 4 sheep with a guy, John, and then 4 sheep, like if John actually has 4 sheep, that's true. If John does not have any sheep, that's like a false set of hieroglyphics. He's trying to figure out what's true and false and figure out language, right? But you can't separate that, I think, from the fact that he's, you know, in this horrible, horrible situation. Well, one's one of the most horrible things that happened of all time to humanity, right? And in humanity and, you know, throughout. And he's doing these dangerous jobs, then he kind of climbs down and does philosophical work, right? And I think there, you know, he's calling down artillery strikes, doing calculus and trigonometry. If he like calls them wrong, it like doesn't hit the right spot, doesn't hit the enemy's artillery, and then they take fire back and their guys die, right? And so that kind of level of like, I need to be correct in my calculations when I'm up in the artillery spotter's position, then comes into like, this must be simple, like stay with the problem, I need to get this right. And it kind of carries through the sense of urgency. Socrates, again, decorated soldier, Descartes, combat engineer, right? And, you know, like Descartes, like he was in a bunch of campaigns, some of which worked really well, some of which were like a disaster, right? And, you know, some of the combat engineering techniques they were trying to figure out worked, and some of them did not. And he's like, man, like I could be like 100% certain of something and then turn out to be wrong, right? Like I can go in like, this is going to work great, and then does not work at all. How do I know that anything is true? Right? Like we could think that there's like 3 enemy divisions over there, and then they're like not there at all. It's a decoy. They're over there in this other place coming to ambush us, right? Like, man, how do I even know like what I'm seeing is correct? Well, one thing, I think, therefore I am. I know that's true. I'm thinking, so something exists. Yeah, could a non-soldier have had this thought? I mean, like, yeah, probably, right? But was that thought had by a non-soldier? No, that thought was had by a soldier. Do you know what I mean? Somebody in a difficult situation where they're trying to figure out, hey, I believe something's true. Then I'm wrong. Then like I'm risking getting killed. My friends are risking getting killed. Right? How do I know it's true? Brought a lot of urgency to it. So I don't think the genie is going back in the bottle. Like, I don't think we're going to be like, hey, every scientist, you're actually like really a philosopher. You're like one of the crown jewels of philosophy. And hey, like academic departments, like everybody should like cross-train and, you know, all the experimental sciences sort of stuff. And, you know, like we should put it all back together. I just don't think that's going to happen. Right. But I think there is still a type of philosophy practice as like a sideline to main profession, someone who's in industry, as opposed into a completely speculative domain. So I would say there's something that I call industrial philosophy. This is practiced by people in industry. I don't mean like industrial revolution. I mean just in industry, as opposed to academic philosophy, which is practiced by people for the sake of practicing the philosophy, right? Peter and I talked about this. And Peter said, oh, it's like a practical philosophy versus theoretical. And like, yes, very often that's the case. I think that's totally true. I don't want to throw shade at people in academia. There is some good work happening in academia, right? I think maybe the blind spot in academia is that they don't classify some people like Feynman, like John Boyd, like a bunch of modern people in finance and computer science as philosophers, right? You know, Ben Franklin had that famous moment in his autobiography, right? Wonderful, wonderful book, Ben Franklin's autobiography, where, you know, he gets a letter of introduction from the governor of Massachusetts or Pennsylvania to somebody in England to set him up with all kinds of printing related stuff. So he gets a letter of introduction. He's excited. He thinks he's going to go get rich in London. He gets off the boat and somebody looks at the letter and be like, oh, this guy is a bum. Nobody likes this guy. He doesn't have any credit. I don't really have much of a relationship with this guy. yeah, what's this letter? This letter's worth nothing. Like, you got an intro from the governor. That governor's a scoundrel, right? And Franklin's like, man, I just spent all my cash to take a ship across the Atlantic Ocean. I'm in London now. And he goes and just gets a job at a printing hall. Has to work his way out of it. And he learns something difficult about human nature and about entrepreneurship there, about like just believing, you know, based on kind of hope, on what you want to be true, that you're getting set up, you're gonna be a made man in London, you're getting introduced by the governor. Governor's a scoundrel. He really savages the governor in that book, right? And so he learns that. And does that filter into some of his, later his moral philosophy, his political philosophy? I think almost certainly. Like, he was dead sure, and the whole time on the boat ride to London, he's doing whatever you do on a boat ride, playing cards, hanging out, reading books, talk with people. He's thinking, I'm going to set up, I'm going to get lines of credit, I'm going to get all kinds of equipment, I'm going to be a master printer very quick. Yeah, not so much, right? Sometimes people can be unreliable or misrepresent themselves a little bit. He learns that the hard way. Feynman has some wonderful stuff. We'll get into him. We'll get into him a little later in this series. Obviously, Nobel Prize winning physicist. Obviously worked on the Manhattan Project as a young scientist, and then just really a widely loved person in science, talking about clear thinking, the benefits of that. Same with John Boyd, the fighter pilot and mechanical engineer. Invented some stuff like energy maneuverability, or discovered the energy maneuverability equations that are still used in aircraft engineering, but also just thought about, like, how does creativity happen? How do we, like, take apart ideas and turn them into new ideas? Very practical guy. As a fighter pilot, if the Russian plane gets behind your plane, you're dead, right? And if it does not, and you wind up behind them, you're in good shape, right? And how does that filter into thinking about creativity and learning and cooperation? In all of these fields, in entrepreneurship, in science, and soldiering, finance, and computer science, you be fully convinced you're right and be wrong, right? And I do think that filters back in. So what I want to do is, I would like to work on some of kind of the probably like intermediate level, right? Intermediate level. We're not going to do like the very basics of things like scientific literacy. We'll do like an intermediate level. I've done some stuff on scientific literacy with people before, and even in like really scientifically literate audiences, nobody has come across every single one of the principles and has studied them well and whatever. So, like, get some like ways to think about the world, and some skills and some practical tools to just like think really clearly, and to do great work. And I think that can also make you better moral philosopher, right? Because I think very often when somebody says, here's the right way to act in a situation, here's how I want to act in a situation, there's implicitly, not always stated, like a prediction of like, and things will go well if we do that, right? So when you've got the skills and the tools and the ways of thinking to be like, I'm really sure this is going to work good, but wait, it doesn't work good, you start to question, right? And I think it can help you evolve, the more abstract things, your moral philosophy, your theories about knowledge or beauty or character or virtue or whatnot, right? So we're going to look to make it really practical. It's a little bit of theoretical material. I'm going to recommend that we start with, and, we'll see how people want to engage with this a little bit. We could do some small goals and small experiments in an ad hoc way. And I do encourage you to run one of them going into the next year, even a few days of doing this. I'm going to like really try my very best to give you some skills and some tools and some ways of thinking that will just like make you more effective at like both just like doing stuff in the real world. So like, hey, it's January, everybody gets like January 1st fever. Like, let's make this the year that everything goes amazing. Like, okay, cool, let's do some of that. But I think that can filter back in your thinking and make you a clearer thinker, right? So we'll do a little tiny bit of statistics, right? Just a little bit. And if people don't like math, we'll keep it cool. Just do a little bit of it, right? We'll do a little bit of intermediate scientific literacy. How do you evaluate results, right? Super helpful, by the way, if you haven't already done this, for like when you see something like chocolate cures cancer, in a newspaper or whatever, you'll be able to like take a look at that and say, is there anything here? Like in like 30 seconds, right? There's like a lot of common error patterns around how media talks about science, being able to identify, hey, actually, this is like a pretty hot scientific trend or industry trend, or like, yeah, this is just some fluff. The ability to just like look at that and know instantly. There's like really just a set of tools that good scientists and people in industry use. We'll go through some of those. It's pretty cool. And then, yeah, I'm going to recommend that we actually, for everybody that wants to opt into it, and I'll make some time to go through all of these and look at these and do what I can to set you up. I really don't just want this to be, hopefully it's kind of entertaining and interesting and whatnot, but you know, for me, the goal is that you bring something with this maybe for the rest of your life that's useful, right? So in terms of setting policies, goals, experiments, let me show you a little one that I did. I've done a bunch of stuff like this, right? But here was a really interesting one that I did. This is many years back. This was like a kind of a primitive version. I got some sophisticated stuff now, but I wanted to show you just something that's like, this is the first time I tried doing this out, right? This was when I was seeing, hey, I want to have more fun in my life. Fun. Column F, fun, right? What was my mood at the start of the day? What was my mood at the end of the day? 80% plus, I forget if that was mood or did I feel like I was productive? I think that was like, did I feel like I got 80th percentile productivity out of myself? Because this is the time that I needed to be productive. Did I do fitness that day? I just wanted to see how that correlated, right? And then did I have fun? And then this was just some like written explanation text, right? So what I did is just in the morning, I wrote down how I was feeling in a spreadsheet. So on 12 August of whatever year this was, multiple years ago, I was okay. And at the end of the day, I was tired. And at the start of 13 August, I was distracted. At the end of the day, I was tired. But at the start of 14 August, I was feeling strong, and then I was feeling good at the end of the day. 15, I wrote adrenaline. I don't know. I guess I was like pretty hyped up, right? You know? And then I was exhausted at the end of the day. Slow and good at the start of the day at that one, a little slow, but good. Flat at the end of the day. So I would just write these observations down, and then I started to see patterns, right? I started to see, hey, some days I'm starting tired, distracted, right? And some days I'm ending tired, exhausted, right? Later, when I did a different version, as I added a track in the middle of the day thing, right? But I was able to start working on like, hey, why is this the case? And trying to wake up feeling stronger and trying to go to bed feeling better. And like I derived some stuff that like worked really well that I still do to this day, many years later, right? And this just like, this looks like a big headache. It's really not. Start of the day, I type in one word here, or 2 words. At the end of the day, I write 1 word. Did I feel like I gave 80% today? Did I do fitness? Was the day fun? Right? And then I wrote some notes as to why. Doing this kind of thing, you learn a lot about yourself because, you know, like the days and the weeks blend together, right? The days and the weeks kind of just blend together otherwise, but seeing, hey, okay. And I intentionally didn't pick, I've got ones that are like glorious, right? And put those online, put those on Instagram or whatever. Like, look at how amazing I did, right? But this is just like, hey, this was like 3 weeks in August, whatever, 3-4 years ago, right? Which was like, how was I doing? Okay, I started good, but slow. And I was satisfied at the end of the day, but I was like tired, distracted. And like, why, you know? And like, I kind of like looked into it. So you could do things like that, right? You could just do very simple observations. It doesn't even have to be this complex. Just record the state of something at some time interval, right? You could set a policy and see how that works for you. One that I did that was super interesting. This one's kind of neat. If anyone is a moderately heavy caffeine user, very, very interesting. You probably have no idea how much caffeine you're having because there's a variable amount in coffees. And if you're not very precise about it, and sometimes you have an energy drink and sometimes you have a coffee, you probably have no idea how many milligrams of caffeine you have at what times, right? So sometimes what I'll do is I'll only drink water, but I am a caffeine user, and you can go buy caffeine pills and dose it to the 100 milligram exactly and figure out exactly what timings you want to have caffeine and regulate that. And then just see, how does that affect your sleep? How does that affect your workouts? How does that affect your mood? Right? And you can do these little things. Sounds like a lot of work. It's not. It's pretty simple. And when you get in the habit of doing this, it's much better if you record the data and write down a little bit of what's happening. But even if you don't, if there's a little tiny bit of rigor in the setup, and then you're like trying to pay attention to be like kind of sound in your own mind, you can actually see, hey, like what works for me? What music should I listen to before I go to bed? What should I do before I go to bed? What like will like help me sleep well? If I want to wake up feeling really strong, I want to be in a great mood and do some really cool stuff at the start of the day. What should I do the night before, and what should I do the next day? And there are things that take really under 30 minutes with practice to set up, maybe 90 to 120 minutes, including some discussion, a little bit of thinking about it. If it's the first time you've done it, maybe. And then like a couple minutes a day that will like make the whole morning go well. And like, that's really cool. And as you develop those, then you can bring that to other settings, right? If you're a manager or a team leader, collaborator with people, right? Like, how do I make a meeting go really well, right? Like, how do I have a great meeting? A lot of meetings like kind of suck, right? Like, how do we have like great meetings with each other, right? If you're meeting a friend, Like, how do we have like a lot of fun together? Like, if you get together with your friend sometimes, and like sometimes like super fun, sometimes like just whatever, it's just okay. Like, couple line entry, like what's the first thing we did? What's the main thing we did? What's the last thing we did? And like, how fun was it? I know, this is like quite analytical, but it can be great. If you prefer, if you're in a very work focused mode and some of this personal optimization stuff seems a little bit extraneous, you could pick a metric to track. Obvious one would be, as a writer, you could pick your words that you put down that day. Obviously, it's also possible to just write down the start time and end time of when you were working, to pick up on how much you've worked. It can be very small. Small is good. We can do this interactively a little bit if we want. So what I would like to do is, for anybody that's interested in this, I'd be very happy to reason with you and discuss with you how to maybe set up some things like this, and what tracking it might look like, and how to make it as lightweight and easy as possible. There's all kinds of like little nuancy, finicky points that if you get them better, it's a lot lower friction, and a lot more likely to yield. And maybe you get a little bit of a easier to work with, to review later, to figure out what works for you. And it can be really, really good. I'm also happy to take general questions, but I'd love to start with, does anyone want to do the experimentation thing? And then I will just caveat as one thing. Yeah, just the one caveat, like, I'm going to be quite cagey and not maximally supportive on things that fall into the categories of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Like, all right, like, I'm a CEO. There's like very like, has an MBA from Yale CEOs. I'm not one of those that is like, all right, we're going to do that. Like, I'm pretty cool. I'm like hip, but there's a bit of a sense of propriety. You know, if you want to talk about regulating your caffeine usage, great. You know, if you're going to talk about, you know, recreational drugs, or, you know, messing with your own like pharmacological timings or something of prescription drugs, I can like edge of reason about those with you, but I'll have to tell you to talk to your doctor, and I'll have to be a little bit of cagey. And then, yeah, just anything that's a little bit, I don't know, polarizing or not polite society topics, I'll just be a little bit cagey. So just, you know, forgive me, I'm a CEO, whatever, propriety, you know, that's, you know, I admire the guy with a lantern walking around that just like very DJF about it in ancient Greece. You know this one, like the guy walking around with a lantern in broad daylight. Everyone know this one? It was Diogenes, right? He's walking around with a lantern, like back then, by the way, people forget this about the story. Back then, like good quality, like burning wood for like torches or lanterns that you can light were like expensive. Everything was like much more expensive in modern production techniques, right? He's walking around with a lit lantern in the middle of the daytime. So I was like, Diogenes, what the heck are you doing? The sun is out. Why do you have that? He's like, I'm looking for an honest man and I can't find one. It's just one of those ancient Greece stories. So hey, jump in if you want. There's a couple of ways to think about this. There's a couple years to think about this. Yep, nope, not doing that. Not doing sex and drugs at rock and roll. We can talk about music if you want. I had rock and roll as a stand-in for iconoclastic, societally, we're going to destroy society with our electric guitars. I was looking in a little bit about how people thought electric guitars were destructive to society a while ago, a little bit of a moral panic around electric guitars back in the day. Yeah, that kind of stuff I'll be a little bit whatever on. But yeah, think about it. Maybe we start with chat and then people can talk. What is kind of interesting for you to optimize or to experiment with, if anything? This could be related to mood. This could be related to how you start the day, end the day. It can be very, very simple. It can be related to what you eat and drink, water, coffee, caffeine, how you relate with people, how your conversations go, what topics you pick, preparing for conversations by like writing down, hey, here's 3 topics that might be interesting before you have a social call with somebody, and then seeing where they actually interesting for both of you. What's kind of interesting? Like, give me a chat if you like.
And
we'll do some.
This will go on YouTube, but if you want to jump off mute and ask us to pause it, we can pause it, or you can just email me afterwards and I can just edit whatever people want to veto. So I just wanted to presence that. If you want to speak freely here at the Stoa, it's welcome.